how much flexibility or autonomy do you have over your curriculum? Are you able to integrate CI techniques and procedures? Now, this can be a bit challenging if your curriculum is aligned with chapters in a textbook or has prescribed units. Today, I speak with Ashley Mikkelsen, who is a Spanish teacher in North Dakota. Ashley talks us through her personal journey of experiencing integrating CI activities into her textbook-aligned curriculum that also includes common assessments. And these assessments are not always proficiency-based. Is this possible? Yes, and Ashley shows us how with her quintessential realistic lens. So let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and thank you, as always, for taking the time out of your week to listen to a podcast about language teaching. Just one of those many things, as I always tell you, that makes you an incredible educator. So thank you so much for doing that. Today, we're going to be talking about textbooks, but in a little different way than we might have talked about them in the past. This is going to be a conversation about comprehensible input in CI, which is something we always talk about. We know how important that is now. But then sometimes you're in a situation where you have to use a textbook or you have a curriculum that isn't so CI aligned. So can this be together? Does this have to be an either or a both and? So that's the conversation for today. She has an 8-month-old as well as 2 other children. So she's taken a little time to focus on creating materials for teachers and supporting teachers through social media and giving some ideas that way. But she has plans to go back in the classroom at some point. But this is sort of joining me for this conversation is Ashley Mikkelsen, who you may know as Señorita Spanish out there in Instagram and on her blog. And she is a Spanish teacher in North Dakota. And she was telling me that she is involved with her state language association, which is FLAND, F-L-A-N-D in North Dakota. And I always have to give shout outs to the state language association. So I wanted to make sure and get that out as well. And this is actually Ashley's second time on the podcast. She was on episode 86 and we talked all about reading strategies. I'm going to link that in the show notes because it is an episode that gets listened to all the time because there are so many excellent tips and suggestions for doing reading activities that she gave. So make sure that you go back and listen to that episode if you have not already. So Ashley Mikkelsen, welcome back to the World Language Classroom Podcast.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be back.
We're going to talk about CI, comprehensible input, and the connection to possibly having to do it along with a textbook. So let's look at your origin story when it comes to CI and textbooks.
The first time I was ready to get rolling with CI, 3 days beforehand, Allison from Mis Clases Locas hosted a free conference. And I think 5 of us from our district, maybe 6. It was a very full Suburban. Piled into the car, road tripped over to Iowa, and we just had an amazing experience. It was full of demonstrations, lots of real examples of how this looks. And the examples were in German. So that car was full of Spanish teachers. And we were just so taken aback by how confident we felt in German after just like a few days. We kind of had this crazy thing happen where flights got weird with some of the presenters, and we had an airport in our town. So we wound up taking one of the presenters home with us to try and catch a flight later, like the next day, instead on a flight out of our city. And since he came with us, he helped us in the car on the way home. We literally changed our lesson for the next day to try and make it more input driven, I guess, for lack of a better word, to try and apply some of those things that we had learned at the conference. And so we're in the back of the Suburban, all piled in. Somebody was sitting in that middle seat because we got all squishy. We're like typing furiously, trying to come up with a story that fits what we were going to do because we were just about to start a new chapter. And we said, okay, we can do this. Like, there's a way for us to do this. And Craig, poor Craig, we like kidnapped him. He came to our classes and watched us try this and gave us some advice and some pointers after we had done this. And after a whirlwind conference demoing, trying out the first day, we said, bye, Craig. Thanks so much for your help, and put him on his plane. And we were like, okay, that was day one. Now what? Mm-hmm. We were so excited. I tend to be a person who, like, when I get an idea, I don't stop. I just like full steam ahead. I'm just like, we're going to do it. We're going to do this thing, and we're doing the thing. Let's think about how we can make this work.
At that time, you were using a textbook in your classroom, and the curriculum was sort of passing through that textbook, right? What was that journey like to try to do CI and have that textbook early on? I'm sure we're going to talk about a lot of things you've figured out since, but that initial takeoff there, what was that like?
It was a little bit of I want to say like a sprinting start, not even just a running start. We just like full bore, dove right into it. We started by, and I've talked about this before, making a story that goes with what we have to do. So because we have that textbook, we had a specific set of vocabulary, we had a specific set of grammar, and a very specific timeline. I was part of a very large department because we had like 13 sections of Spanish 1 or something like that. There were a good number of Spanish teachers teaching the same sections, and we had worked really, really hard to be same page. And that was really important to us because we did have kids who would switch from section to section. And it was so nice because we worked so closely together as a department that somebody could walk out of my classroom, walk into my colleague's classroom, and just not miss a beat, because that's how close we were teaching. So when we started implementing this, that's where that got a little bit trickier, because CI is so much more fluid that when we were doing like story asking, and when we started implementing some of those kinds of strategies where it's really student response is helping us kind of co-create these stories, there were a few times where it's like, well, it took us a little bit longer to get through this part, or it took a wild turn here. And those moments were really exciting and really fun to share between colleagues. But it was also like, oh, but we didn't get to this part that we had all planned on getting to today because, we took that left turn. And that was a little bit difficult. And the more we progressed through that first chapter, we were working to really implement things, the more that we realized that this was more difficult than we realized to do as a whole team that had really been very grammar focused, really, really very textbook driven. We have a big final at the end of the year coming up. It's multiple choice. It's going to look like this. It's like 200 questions. We really need to make sure we're hitting these things because they're going to go to Spanish 2 and they're going to be expected to know these things. We have to hold them accountable for, we shuffle kids around all the time.
When you started doing these CI-based activities in your classroom, how did that look differently than, say, a month or two earlier than what you were doing in your classroom?
We used to do what I would call like really traditional like vocabulary introduction activities. We might do a slide where we read the words together. We'd read the list. They would read and translate on their vocabulary list. Then we would spend maybe 2 to 3 days working with that vocabulary and like matching activities or really scaffolded speaking activities or that sort of thing. And then on day 5, they would have a vocabulary quiz. Like that was the plan, pretty much every unit with slightly different activities, but that's what we did. And then when we switched, it really became, let's write a story using the vocab words that aren't cognates for the most part. Like we'd use cognates in there, of course, but the words that we know that they're going to have a little bit more trouble with getting and that they'll need more time with. And we really focused on those in our stories. And then the first week of the chapter really became, let's read a story in, whatever way we're going to read the story, like that reading activities discussion we had before. That's where those would come in. And then we'd either do more reading activities with it, or we'd do like a version B of the story or a version C where we expanded it or used swapped out some other details to get some more of the vocabulary in. And while we were doing that, that's where we would do like some formative assessments. But it really started shifting away from that kind of rinse and repeat recipe.
You said earlier when you first started talking about it, you said, okay, we have to make a story with what we have to do.
Yes.
Right. So that's what you're referring to in terms of here's the chapter, here's the list of vocabulary.
Yep.
So make a story with what we have to do. So when I opened the discussion earlier, I said CI in a textbook, does it have to be an either or can it be like this both and? So that seems like that was your response to kind of, you can't do away with the textbook, because I think a lot of teachers are listening is like, it's great, but I still have to follow this curriculum in my school. I actually can't change that. So you found this way to incorporate the predetermined or the prescribed curriculum into the stories there. So let's dive into that a bit more, because I think that's the place where teachers are. Give me any random chapter that might have come up.
Sure. So the one that I'm thinking of that's right off the top of my head, because that was this time frame, was to-dare expressions.
Mm-hmm.
So like those idiomatic expressions, there's a little bit of weather in there, but really that was like the hefty part, was practicing conjugating to-dare and then using it with all those different expressions. So what we did was we wrote down a list of those expressions and we wrote down some scenarios, like what are some settings that we could do with this, some of the vocabulary. And basically we brainstormed just silly, like it was just silly. It's just a silly story because that's okay. We wanted it to be comprehensible and engaging for them. And as we were going through, we'd cross off like, okay, we put this in, cross off. Okay, we put that in, cross off. We put that in. And then we'd look at it and say, okay, is it simple enough? Because really what we found at first is it was like 25 sentences long. And that was really just too much. And so then as we got better at it, we realized like, okay, your first run through can literally be like 7 to 9 sentences. And that's like plenty. But then you're going, well, 7 to 9 sentences doesn't give you a lot of vocabulary and grammar. And that's where those version B, version C started coming in, where, we'd swap out a character, we might swap out a setting, but the general plot is the same. So students get that repetition and they feel comfortable because we just spent a day or 2 or 3 working with that other story. And now they're like, oh, okay, I see where this is going. But you're able to kind of tweak some of those details and they're like, okay.
So tell us a bit about your students' engagement and motivation and all that stuff, because you're using the same material from the chapter. You're just engaging in a different way with it. So what was that like?
Their language use just like exploded. And so for a little bit more reference, this was in the spring. So they'd had a full semester of like traditional Spanish. And even maybe a full quarter, like we were pretty close to the end of the year. I want to say we had maybe 3 or 4 chapters left of the book. So we really had done this for quite a while. And when we started implementing the story asking procedures, like I need you to give me some sort of verbal response to let me know that you're understanding or if you're confused. And let's play these signals and add these storytelling jobs in. The classroom just came alive. I mean, it's not like they were not into it before, but it was like they were into it because we were playing a game and the Spanish happened to be happening. And this way it was like you could tell that they were into the Spanish, communicating the story, and they were just like getting it. And they were taking that ownership of what's going to happen next and how are we going to do this. And even between the class periods, I could see some kids would like talk at lunch and they'd be like, our class did this, was our main character, or like my friend told me that her 7th period did blah, blah. And I'm like, just hearing them talk about that and feeling that excitement was so neat. And then I remember the first time we had them do like a writing sample and it was just like, oh my gosh, like, wow. I mean, some of them were, I would call it like outwriting my 2s at that point in the year. I was like, they're doing things that like my 2s, I mean, I wouldn't expect my 2s to be able to read this even, like kind of thing was happening. And I was just amazed at such a change in their confidence. They weren't spending all their time being like, I can't say this. Like, I want to say this, but I can't say this. It was like it opened the door to them realizing how much they could do and how much they were actually capable of with a language.
And so now that you've had some time with it, that was sort of your origin story, right? So once you had some time and years of using it, and not just with that beginner level, but maybe with your twos, if you had other levels from there. So what have you developed over time as your ways of continuing to engage with the textbook curriculum along with doing CI in your classroom?
It became kind of this tricky balance because our department became pretty divided on how are we going to do that balance? How are we going to tick these boxes that we need to tick for the curriculum? And how are we're not going to upend everything that we've been doing. And I was fully on the end of let's upend everything, like let's go. And that was really hard because I am full and like head first charging, let's go do this thing. And that's not everybody's personality when they encounter something new, right? Some people are like, hold on a second, let's like ease into this. Let's feel how this works. Because there was a strong sense of, well, what we have been doing has been successful. We have a strong AP program. We have a strong set of Spanish 4s. Like we're seeing this happen. So why make these changes? And that became a really difficult conversation to have because there were several different voices and several different sets of opinions. And, you need to work together. And that can be kind of hard when there's so many different thoughts and so many different feelings about how this would all work. So what wound up happening the next year and just kind of in the next few years was a gradual shift to teachers who wanted to make change, found ways to make change within boundaries. And teachers who wanted to keep doing what they'd been doing mostly did that. Every now and then there was something where an activity would get shared between, and it was a great listening activity, or it was a great, infographic or reading something that we'd pulled together and we'd share it between us. But it really kind of settled out into some people in the department making some pretty big shifts and some people kind of taking some baby steps and some people going, I don't know that this is the right fit for my levels. It was kind of a careful tightrope of walking or finding that balance.
What you're describing as that departmental divide, I think is a reality. And a lot of times when we talk about, oh, we're all on board and we're CI and we're going to our conferences and we're listening to our podcast, that we have this expectation you're going to go back to your school and your department and everyone's going to be on board. That would be the perfect scenario, but it's not always the case. So it was interesting to hear, and from your direct experience of doing it, of having that divided department. And there are certain things, like even when you said at the very beginning, which I already quoted, you make a story with what you have to cover, So it's like, okay, that's how you're building the bridge. And then you said that you were making changes within boundaries. Again, like that's a wisdom moment. As many suggestions as we can give to, when you go back and do this, but to hear from your actual experience, like this is how we solved that. And also that idea that not everyone got on board. Because I also think with CI, it takes a particular demeanor and personality to do some of the activities. Like it's not going to be in the wheelhouse of every teacher. So if you can find a way of getting students to where they need to get to with a different approach, then go for it.
I think that it's so important to remember as you're kind of in the middle of, well, we want to do this and they aren't on board. It's so important to remember that every teacher wants what they think is best for their students. So as you're having these discussions, it can feel really like you're just tearing up inside sometimes because you don't understand and you feel so frustrated. And it's so important to go back to, they want what's best for their students. I want what's best for my students. We want what's best for our students. We can work together to make that happen. Because that, if you keep coming back to that as your department and you approach that with your colleagues as understanding they want what's best for their students, and you know that when you're having those conversations with them, it can make everything feel so much better and it can be such a more open and positive conversation when you really approach it with that.
We're always trying to find the new things. But I do have a question.
Okay.
And this comes to the idea of common assessments. I know a lot of people listening right now are like, we have common assessments. And when I coach teachers and they're like, I want to do CI, but I have these common assessments that are grammar based and everything at the end. How did that play out with your situation?
That is an important nuance. So we did actually have quite a few common assessments. You do need to have that element of backward design as you're planning and creating your lessons. You need to look at the assessments and say, okay, what is it that we're assessing? What are we needing them to do? So there were so many times where my Spanish ones could get whatever they needed to do for the vocabulary quiz out of the stories and readings, no problem. And there were several times where they could get whatever they needed to do out of like reading activities and maybe some like rewriting activities for the grammar portion. However, there were some times where like, okay, we just need to have a grammar lesson because that's where we're at. So there would be times where, maybe we'd spend like probably 8 days with a story and activities and that sort of stuff. And then on day like 7 or 8 of that unit, we'd say, okay, now we're going to explain what you've been seeing. And it would be maybe 5 to 10 minutes of like, look at this, draw attention to this. Do you see how these things match? Can you kind of pull out these patterns? We tried to do it a lot of that way, but then we would do a few that were like, okay, you're going to see multiple choice on this test coming up. Can you work with that? We kind of pull in a few of those activities here and there. So I will say that grammar would at times be a more blended approach than I think people would consider CI friendly. But again, it's working within that boundary. So we would always check with the chapter test and say, okay, how is this structured? What are they going to have to do? Make sure we, have all the vocabulary, all of that sort of stuff, and working backwards.
I had a podcast interview really early on with John Bracey when I first started the podcast, and it always stuck with me when I asked for his advice at the end. I always asked, what's your advice? And he said at the end, don't get fired. That's what he said. He said, my advice is don't get fired. And he was speaking to exactly what you were just saying. It's if you're going to go all in on something, but the expectation is that students are passing or doing well on this common assessment, which might not be aligned yet. I would say yet, because it's moving towards that. But in the meantime, don't get fired, because if you're not doing your job, then nobody is going to be teaching that way. So we have to find those ways to embrace and make peace with that while we're in this transition period. But that kept going back and forth in my mind as you were saying that. I'm like, she did what she did, what she had to do to not get fired.
Yes. That is such a, like, when you say that's a good piece of advice, that's such a piece of wisdom. Yeah. There are times where you might feel like, oh, this isn't right, or I don't know how this fits in with what I'm doing. Do what you got to do. Like, make sure at the end of the day, your job is to help those kids be successful. And sometimes that means being successful at school while you're getting them to acquire the language. So it's kind of like, we're back to that tricky balance again. And it is a trickier balance than I think we maybe consider at first.
Yeah, it's so important for us to keep that in mind when we talk about trying something new and having this idea that you can just go and run with it and everything's going to be okay. But you're also constrained by things like grades. You have no choice. You have to put a grade on the end. You got to put a grade on a report card. It has to be a letter with a plus or a minus after it. And as much as we want to move towards proficiency-based grading and competency-based grading, I talk a lot about that. But in the meantime, before we get there, you have to transfer your competency-based grade into an A or B or a C, because that's the expectation. Because if you don't, you're going to get fired.
Reality is important.
It is so important. And I love conversations with you, Ashley, because you keep it so real. Even that, like thinking back to our previous episode when we talked about reading, I remember you giving tips about this is what they're going to try to do, so watch out for it.
Yeah,
it's not going to work if you don't do it this way, because they're going to be 13 years old about it. They're going to be 16 years old about it, and I so much appreciate that reality lens that you put on it. Do you have any recommendations specifically for teachers who might be new to CI and have a textbook?
The first step I would recommend is finding like-minded people who are working with the same textbook as you. And whether that's in person, whether that's a connection online, There are lots of Facebook groups that are like teaching CI with textbook name. Find those, connect with those people, because it is a lot of heavy lifting at first. And if you're trying to do it by yourself, then just do like one chapter every so often, because it's a lot. So if you can find people to work with, it's going to make that load lighter.
I didn't realize there were Facebook groups that were specific to, I have to use this textbook and do CI. That is the most niche collaboration possible.
I know, but it's good because it's a lot to do by yourself. So if you can share and connect and build resources together, that just makes things so much better.
How can our listeners be connecting with you, Ashley Mikkelsen?
Instagram, I'm there, Señorita Spanish. YouTube, I've been working really hard to share lessons and ideas in a video format so people can get that idea. But if you're not a video watcher, I also write everything on my blog. So I know some people prefer to watch or listen. Some people prefer to read. So I'm trying to help you out there.
Mm-hmm. I'll make sure that everything's in the show notes as well. I always like to leave our listeners with a hearty piece of advice at the end. So what can you leave with us?
It kind of echoes back to something we were talking about before, where you were saying it takes a certain person to do some of these activities, right? It takes a certain personality type or energy type. I just want to say that there are so many different ways to deliver comprehensible input to your students that sometimes you see something online and you say, I could never do that. That's just not me. Then don't do that. Do one of the other activities that is more like you. And then just finding that balance. And I have a YouTube video where I talk about high energy, low energy, and high energy for students, low energy for teacher, high energy for teacher, low energy for students, and just kind of covering all those realms. Because I think finding that balance of what fits you best as a teacher and as a person, and what fits your students best in their classroom needs can make your teaching year so much better.
Ashley, I learned so much from you, and I know our listeners are as well. Thank you so much for being here.
I had so much fun. Thanks for having a good conversation with me.
What are your takeaways from that conversation with Ashley Mikkelsen? I hope that you're seeing ways to align CI objectives with a textbook. Be sure to check out the show notes to connect with Ashley Mikkelsen. You'll also see the link to sign up for Talking Points, my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. There are also links to get in touch with me if you'd like to work together. We can do that either in person in your school or remotely. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. Let's keep the conversation going on social media. Connect with me on X, aka Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WL Classroom. And for even more valuable resources, visit my website, WLClassroom.com, where you'll find over 300 blog posts about language teaching. So stay inspired, keep growing, and continue making a difference in your language classroom.